13.5 meters beneath the U.S.-Mexico border, a ventilation fan hums in the darkness. The tunnel stretches 600 meters, longer than 6 football fields, carved through clay and rock with mining-grade precision. Reinforced walls, electric lighting, a rail system capable of moving hundreds of kilos in minutes. It took 2 years to build, cost millions, and required engineers, electricians, and laborers working in shifts around the clock. But here's the question no one asks. Who inherits an empire built on tunnels? When the old cartel bosses fall, arrested, extradited, or killed, their sons don't abandon the infrastructure. They adapt it. And in the age of fentanyl, a single tunnel run can move enough product to kill a city. This is the story of how the next generation turned their father's smuggling highways into something far more lethal. To understand why this matters, you need to grasp a fundamental paradox. Fentanyl is not like the drugs that justified building tunnels in the first place. A lethal dose is 2 milligrams. That's the weight of a mosquito. A single kilogram contains roughly 500,000 lethal doses. You could fit enough fentanyl to supply a mid-sized American city for a month inside a laptop bag. U.S. Customs and Border Protection data confirms what this math suggests. More than 90% of fentanyl seized at the southern border enters through legal ports of entry, hidden in vehicle door panels, strapped to pedestrians crossing at San Isidro, concealed in commercial cargo trucks passing through inspection lanes at Otay Mesa. The drug is so compact, so potent, that the elaborate underground infrastructure cartels spent decades building seems almost obsolete. Yet in June 2025, federal agents discovered that 600-meter tunnel beneath Otay Mesa. It wasn't a relic. It was operational. The ventilation system was running. The lights worked. The rail tracks showed recent use. Someone had invested millions of dollars and 2 years of labor to complete it, knowing full well that fentanyl doesn't require this kind of logistical apparatus. So why build it? The answer isn't found in the economics of smuggling. It's found in the psychology of inheritance and the operational imperatives of proving you can still operate at your father's scale. To understand the sons, you first need to understand what the fathers built. The golden age of cross-border tunnels began in the 1990s and peaked in the 2010s, driven by the economics of marijuana and cocaine. These drugs were bulky. A profitable load meant tons, not kilos. Surface routes were increasingly compromised by surveillance technology, canine units, and inspection protocols. Tunnels offered a solution, a controlled environment immune to aerial surveillance, capable of moving massive volumes with minimal exposure to interdiction. The Arellano Felix organization, which controlled the Tijuana corridor, pioneered sophisticated tunnel construction in the early 2000s. In 2006, authorities discovered a 2,400-foot tunnel connecting a warehouse in Tijuana to a warehouse in Otay Mesa, California. It featured lighting, ventilation, and a concrete floor. The engineering was professional. The exit points were carefully selected industrial properties where truck traffic wouldn't raise suspicion. The tunnel represented a multi-million-dollar investment, but the return justified the cost. Before it was discovered, intelligence analysts estimate it moved tons of marijuana and cocaine, generating revenues that dwarfed the construction expense. But it was the Sinaloa cartel, under Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, that perfected the model. In 2010, authorities discovered a tunnel stretching more than 2,600 feet, equipped with a rail system running its entire length. The rails allowed workers to move carts loaded with drugs, dramatically increasing throughput. Ventilation shafts prevented carbon dioxide and methane buildup. Reinforced walls ensured structural integrity even under the weight of buildings and traffic above. When agents raided the connected warehouses, they seized more than 40 tons of marijuana. The tunnel had likely been operational for months, possibly years before detection. These weren't amateur operations. Cartel engineers used mining-grade equipment. They employed geologists to assess soil composition and avoid unstable ground. They hired electricians to install lighting and ventilation systems that could run continuously without triggering utility anomalies that might alert authorities. They coordinated with corrupt officials on both sides of the border to ensure construction noise and truck traffic didn't prompt investigations. The tunnels were marvels of criminal engineering, and they worked. For every tunnel discovered, intelligence analysts suspect several more remained operational, their locations known only to a compartmentalized cell within the cartel's logistics apparatus. Then the architects began to fall. El Chapo was arrested in 2016, extradited to the United States in 2017, and sentenced to life in prison in 2019. Other kingpins faced similar fates. Extradition treaties, improved intelligence sharing, and pressure from the U.S. government dismantled the old guard. But the infrastructure didn't disappear. The tunnels remained. The corrupt officials stayed in place. The engineers and laborers who knew how to build these routes were still available. And the sons inherited it all. Iván Archibaldo Guzmán Salazar, Jesús Alfredo Guzmán Salazar, Ovidio Guzmán López, Joaquín Guzmán López. Collectively known as Los Chapitos, the sons of El Chapo assumed control of a significant faction of the Sinaloa cartel following their father's arrest. They were young, in their 20s and 30s, raised in wealth, but also in the shadow of a legend. Their father had escaped from maximum security prisons twice. He had built a trafficking empire that moved billions of dollars in drugs annually. He had become a folk hero in parts of Mexico and a symbol of cartel power worldwide. The sons inherited not just roots and personnel, but a mythos they were expected to uphold. Intelligence analysts suggest the psychological pressure on Los Chapitos was immense. They needed to prove they could operate at their father's level. They faced skepticism from older cartel members, rivals who saw them as privileged and inexperienced, and Mexican and U.S. authorities who assumed the younger generation would be easier to dismantle. At the same time, they inherited an organization in transition. The drug trade was shifting. Marijuana was being legalized in parts of the United States, eroding profit margins. Cocaine remained profitable but faced competition from synthetic drugs. And fentanyl was emerging as the most lucrative product in the cartel's portfolio. Fentanyl changed everything. It was cheap to produce, requiring precursor chemicals that could be sourced from China or synthesized in Mexican labs. It was compact, eliminating the logistical challenges of moving tons of marijuana, and it was devastatingly addictive, creating a captive market. U.S. Department of Justice indictments filed in 2023 directly linked Los Chapitos to large-scale fentanyl trafficking. The charges detailed their role in sourcing precursor chemicals, operating synthesis labs, and coordinating distribution networks. But the indictments did not specifically mention tunnels. That's because, by the time Los Chapitos took control, fentanyl's compactness had made tunnels seem unnecessary for the drug itself. Yet the tunnels kept being built. One can assume this wasn't purely about logistics. It was about capability. In the cartel world, infrastructure signals power. A tunnel represents resources, technical expertise, and the ability to corrupt officials on both sides of an international border. It demonstrates that you can undertake a multi-million-dollar, multi-year project without detection. For Los Chapitos, maintaining and expanding the tunnel network was a way to prove they were not just riding their father's legacy, they were adding to it. There were operational reasons as well. Fentanyl may be compact, but the precursor chemicals used to synthesize it are not. Standard procedure in fentanyl production involves importing bulk chemicals, which are then processed in clandestine labs. These precursors are bulkier and more detectable than the finished product. A tunnel offers a way to move large quantities of precursors without exposing them to the scanning technology and canine units deployed at legal ports of entry. Intelligence analysts suggest that some tunnels discovered in recent years may have been used primarily for precursor smuggling, with the finished fentanyl crossing through conventional routes. Diversification also played a role. While fentanyl dominated headlines, the Sinaloa cartel continued to traffic methamphetamine, cocaine, and heroin. Methamphetamine, in particular, is produced in large quantities in Mexican superlabs and benefits from the kind of bulk transport tunnels provide. A tunnel that moves meth one week and precursor chemicals the next maximizes return on the initial construction investment. The infrastructure becomes a hedge against enforcement surges at ports of entry. When Operation Blue Lotus and similar initiatives increased scanning and inspections at legal crossings, tunnels offered an alternative route that was harder to monitor. Building a tunnel of the scale discovered in June 2025 requires meticulous planning and execution. Site selection is the first challenge. Otay, Mesa, and San Isidro are preferred locations because they sit on the border in areas with significant industrial activity. Warehouses, import-export businesses, and truck traffic provide cover. The geology matters as well. Clay and rock are stable enough to support a tunnel but soft enough to excavate without specialized drilling equipment that would attract attention. Engineers assess the depth required to avoid detection by ground-penetrating radar, typically 10 to 15 meters, and plan the route to avoid underground utilities that could complicate construction or trigger investigations. Construction begins with a vertical shaft, usually dug inside a warehouse or other structure that conceals the activity. Workers excavate in shifts, removing soil and rock in buckets or bags that are disposed of discreetly, often mixed with legitimate construction debris. As the shaft reaches the target depth, horizontal excavation begins. This is the most labor-intensive phase. Workers use hand tools, small pneumatic drills, and occasionally mining equipment to carve the tunnel. Shoring and reinforcement are installed as the tunnel advances, preventing collapse. Ventilation is critical. Without it, carbon dioxide and methane accumulate, creating lethal conditions. Fans and ducts are installed to circulate air, powered by generators or tapped electrical lines. Lighting follows. Strings of LED bulbs or fluorescent tubes run the length of the tunnel, allowing workers to operate around the clock. In the most sophisticated tunnels, rail systems are installed. These consist of metal tracks and carts, similar to those used in mines, allowing workers to move heavy loads efficiently. The exit point on the U.S. side is typically another warehouse, purchased or leased through shell companies to obscure cartel ownership. The entire process takes 18 to 24 months and costs millions of dollars. Every phase requires operational security. Workers are compartmentalized, knowing only their specific task. Bribes ensure that local officials, utility inspectors, and law enforcement look the other way. Counterintelligence efforts monitor U.S. task forces for signs that the tunnel has been detected. Detection is the constant threat. U.S. authorities deploy ground-penetrating radar, seismic sensors, and other technologies to identify anomalies beneath the border. Informants provide tips, often from rival cartels or disgruntled workers. Utility records are analyzed for unusual power consumption that might indicate tunnel lighting or ventilation. Despite these efforts, the detection rate remains low. Estimates suggest that only 10 to 20% of tunnels are discovered before they become operational. The rest move product for months or years until a tip, a mistake, or sheer luck leads authorities to them. When a tunnel is discovered, the response is methodical. Joint task forces involving the DEA, ICE, and Border Patrol conduct simultaneous raids on both ends. Evidence is collected. Arrests are made, though typically of low-level workers rather than cartel leadership. The tunnel is then sealed, a process that involves filling it with concrete or collapsing it in a controlled manner. Remediation costs range from $500,000 to over $1 million per tunnel. Criminal penalties for those convicted of tunnel-related offenses include up to 20 years in prison for using a tunnel to smuggle drugs and up to 10 years for knowingly participating in tunnel construction. The June 2025 discovery at Otay Mesa followed this pattern. Federal agents, acting on intelligence, raided a warehouse on the U.S. side and found the tunnel entrance concealed beneath a false floor. The tunnel stretched 600 meters, terminating in a warehouse in Tijuana. The sophistication was immediately apparent. Reinforced walls, ventilation running, lighting operational, rail tracks showing signs of recent use. Authorities suspect the tunnel was built by a transnational criminal organization, likely a faction of the Sinaloa cartel, though no direct evidence publicly links Los Chapitos or any specific individuals to this particular tunnel. No large drug seizures were reported in connection with the discovery, which is consistent with the pattern of tunnels being detected before major loads are moved or after they have already been used and abandoned. What the tunnel represents, however, is clear. It is a statement of capability. It is a demonstration that despite decades of enforcement efforts, billions of dollars in counter-narcotics spending, and advanced detection technology, cartels can still undertake massive infrastructure projects beneath the most heavily monitored border in the world. For Los Chapitos and others in their position, the tunnel is both a practical asset and a symbol. It says, "We are still here, we are still capable, and we are not going anywhere." But capability comes with a cost, and that cost is measured in human lives. Fentanyl is responsible for more than 70,000 overdose deaths annually in the United States, the majority involving synthetic opioids. The drug is 50 times more potent than heroin and 100 times more potent than morphine. 2 milligrams is enough to kill. Users often don't know they are consuming fentanyl. It is mixed into counterfeit pills, cut into heroin or cocaine, or sold as a standalone product. The margin for error is non-existent. A dose slightly larger than intended is fatal. The supply chain that delivers fentanyl to American streets begins with precursor chemicals, historically sourced from China but increasingly produced in Mexico as Chinese regulations tightened. These chemicals are transported to clandestine labs, often in rural areas of Sinaloa, Jalisco, or Durango, where they are synthesized into fentanyl powder or pressed into pills. The finished product is then smuggled across the border, primarily through legal ports of entry, but also, as the tunnels suggest, through underground routes. Once in the United States, it is distributed through networks that reach every state, every city, every community. The human cost is not abstract. It is families receiving phone calls in the middle of the night. It is parents burying children. It is communities watching entire generations succumb to addiction. It is emergency rooms overwhelmed with overdose cases, first responders administering naloxone in parking lots and public restrooms, and morgues struggling to keep pace with the dead. The tunnel discovered in June 2025 may not have been filled with fentanyl when agents found it, but it was built to serve the same supply chain that delivers the drug. It is part of the infrastructure of death. The United States has spent billions attempting to stop the flow. Tunnel task forces have operated since the 1990s, combining personnel from multiple agencies and deploying cutting-edge technology. Ground-penetrating radar scans the border for voids. Seismic sensors detect vibrations from excavation. Informants are cultivated and paid for tips. When tunnels are discovered, they are sealed at great expense. Legal penalties have been increased. Cooperation with Mexican authorities has improved, though corruption remains a persistent challenge. Yet the tunnels keep being built. For every one discovered, intelligence analysts suspect several more remain operational. The cartels treat tunnel detection as an acceptable loss, a cost of doing business. They build redundancy into their operations, ensuring that the closure of one route does not cripple the entire network. They adapt to enforcement measures, shifting construction techniques, selecting new locations, and employing counter-surveillance to monitor task force activities. The cycle is relentless. Enforcement drives innovation. Innovation drives enforcement. There is no end state, no final victory, only an ongoing contest of resources and ingenuity. Remediation costs alone illustrate the futility. Filling a single tunnel with concrete costs upwards of $500,000. Multiply that by the dozens of tunnels discovered over the past 2 decades, and the expense is staggering. Yet the cartels can afford to lose tunnels. The profit margins on fentanyl are so high that even a single successful load recoups the construction cost. A kilogram of fentanyl, purchased for a few $1,000s in precursor chemicals, sells for tens of thousands wholesale and generates hundreds of thousands in street-level revenue. The economics are overwhelmingly in the cartel's favor. Geopolitical tensions complicate the response. Tunnel construction occurs on Mexican soil, requiring cooperation from Mexican authorities. Corruption within Mexican law enforcement and government means that cartel operations often proceed with the knowledge, if not the active assistance, of officials. U.S. authorities cannot unilaterally act on Mexican territory, and joint operations require extensive coordination and trust. Sovereignty concerns limit the scope of U.S. involvement. The result is a patchwork response, effective in some cases but unable to address the systemic factors that make tunnel construction viable. The legal framework offers some deterrence but is limited in practice. U.S. law imposes severe penalties for tunnel-related offenses, but prosecutions typically target low-level workers rather than cartel leadership. The engineers, financiers, and decision-makers who authorize tunnel construction remain insulated by layers of operational security. They do not visit the tunnels. They do not handle the drugs. They communicate through intermediaries and encrypted channels. When a tunnel is discovered, the individuals arrested are often laborers or warehouse workers, expendable assets who know little about the broader organization. The kingpins remain untouched, free to authorize the construction of the next tunnel. This is the inheritance Los Chapitos and others like them received. Not just tunnels and routes, but a system designed to absorb losses, adapt to enforcement, and continue operating regardless of the human cost. It is an inheritance built on violence, corruption, and the exploitation of addiction. It is an empire that spans borders, corrupts institutions, and leaves a trail of death in its wake. And it is an inheritance that, despite decades of effort and billions of dollars, no one has figured out how to dismantle. What does it mean to inherit an empire built on death? Can the sons escape the sins of their fathers, or are they condemned to repeat them, to expand them, to refine them into something even more lethal? The tunnels beneath the border are more than smuggling routes. They are monuments to a cycle of violence that transcends generations. They are infrastructure that outlasts individuals, persisting long after the men who ordered their construction are dead or imprisoned. They are a testament to the futility of a war that has no clear victory condition, no endpoint, only an endless contest of resources and will. And they are a reminder that for every tunnel discovered, for every cartel leader arrested, the system adapts, the next generation steps forward, and the flow of drugs continues. The question is not whether we can stop it. The question is whether we are willing to confront the demand, the corruption, and the economic desperation that make it possible in the first place. Share your thoughts below.